I was sitting in my cardiologist's plush leather chair, waiting for my routine test results, when my eyes drifted to a silver-framed photograph on his desk. The woman in the picture was wearing a stunning red dress, laughing on the deck of a yacht. It was my wife of 35 years. When the doctor walked in, I casually pointed to the frame and asked who she was. His face immediately lit up. "Oh, that is my fiancée Valerie. We are getting married in the Bahamas next month." My heart stopped. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the ultimate betrayal while planning your next move. My name is Warren Blake. I am a 62-year-old structural engineer, a man who has spent his entire life calculating load-bearing capacities, identifying stress fractures, and ensuring that massive foundations do not collapse under pressure. I know how to spot a tiny crack before it brings down a skyscraper. But nothing in my 4 decades of professional experience could have prepared me for the structural failure of my own life, a collapse that happened right under my nose. 6 months ago, I suffered a mild heart attack. It was a terrifying wake-up call, a sudden reminder of my own mortality that happens to many men my age. My wife Valerie played the role of the devoted, panic-stricken spouse to absolute perfection. She hovered over my hospital bed, held my hand, wiped my brow, and insisted with a fierce, tearful urgency that I transfer my recovery care to an exclusive private clinic downtown. She claimed they had the absolute best cardiac specialists in the state. She personally found Dr. Gavin Pierce, a man she described as a brilliant pioneer in preventative cardiology. I trusted her implicitly. When you have been married to a woman for 35 years, you do not question her motives when she claims she is just trying to keep you alive. Dr. Pierce's clinic was intimidatingly expensive. The waiting room smelled of rich espresso and subtle citrus, completely devoid of the sterile chemical stench of a normal hospital. I was escorted into his private office to wait for the results of my latest echocardiogram. The room was a monument to ego. Framed Ivy League degrees, expensive abstract art, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. And right there, sitting prominently next to a sleek bronze pen holder, was the photograph. I leaned forward in the plush guest chair, thinking my aging eyes were playing cruel tricks on me. The afternoon light from the window caught the polished silver frame. It was Valerie. My Valerie. But it was not the woman I knew. The woman I shared a quiet suburban home with wore conservative blouses, sensible shoes, and complained about the rising cost of groceries. The woman in this photograph was radiant, deeply tanned, and wearing a plunging, brilliant red dress that hugged curves I knew intimately. She was holding a crystal flute of champagne, her head thrown back in a carefree, uninhibited laugh, standing on the polished teak deck of a luxury yacht. I recognized the delicate gold necklace resting against her collarbone. I had bought it for our 30th anniversary in Paris. My chest tightened, a phantom echo of the cardiac event that had brought me to this clinic in the first place. I did not touch the frame. I did not move a muscle. I just stared at the undeniable proof of a parallel universe. 35 years of morning coffees, shared mortgages, raising our son, building a life together, all reduced to a secret trophy photograph on another man's expensive desk. The heavy oak door swung open, pulling me from the suffocating vacuum of my thoughts. Dr. Gavin Pierce strode in, looking every inch the wealthy, successful specialist Valerie had described. He was perhaps 15 years younger than me, impeccably groomed, wearing a tailored suit under his pristine white lab coat. He flashed me a $1 million smile and sat behind his massive desk, completely unaware that I had just discovered the bomb ticking beneath my life. "Warren, my friend, you are looking much better today," he said, opening my thick medical file. I kept my breathing slow and rhythmic, channeling every ounce of analytical discipline I possessed. I forced my facial muscles to relax, constructing an impenetrable facade. "I feel much better." "Doctor," I replied, my voice steady, betraying absolutely nothing. I gestured casually toward the silver frame on the edge of his desk. "That is a beautiful photograph. Who is the lucky lady?" I watched his face closely, analyzing his micro-expressions. There was no hesitation, no guilt, no shadow of deception. He had absolutely no idea who I really was to her. To him, I was just Warren Blake, patient number 402, a wealthy, aging engineer with a bum heart. Valerie had obviously kept my identity completely isolated from his world, creating a firewall between her husband and her lover. Pierce leaned back in his expensive leather chair, a look of pure, arrogant infatuation washing over his face. "Oh, that is my fiancée Valerie," he said, his voice dripping with pride. "She is incredible, is she not? We are getting married in the Bahamas next month. I tell you, Warren, I am a very lucky man." My blood ran colder than ice. The words hit me like physical blows, a sledgehammer to the gut, yet I sat perfectly still. My wife of 3.5 decades was not just having a casual fling. She was engaged. She was actively planning a destination wedding in the Bahamas with the very cardiologist she had handpicked to manage my survival. I did not shout. I did not flip the heavy desk over. I did not lunge across the room and wrap my hands around his throat. Screaming would only give them the advantage. Violence would only warn them that the blind, sick husband had finally opened his eyes. Instead, I weaponized my silence. I smiled, a genuine warm smile of a man making polite conversation. "Congratulations, Dr. Pierce," I said smoothly. "That is wonderful news. You must be very excited." He chuckled, clearly pleased with himself. "Very excited. Now let us talk about your heart, Warren." He shifted his demeanor back to the concerned clinical physician, pulling a prescription pad from his top drawer. "I have been reviewing your latest charts. You are stable, but I am not entirely satisfied with your progress. I am putting you on a new aggressive medication protocol. It is specifically designed to manage your blood pressure fluctuations more effectively." He scribbled rapidly on the pad, tore the sheet off, and handed it across the desk. "Make sure you take these exactly as directed, Warren. We want to keep that heart of yours ticking, do we not?" I took the slip of paper. I looked at the name of the drug, a complex chemical compound I did not immediately recognize. I folded it neatly and slid it into my breast pocket. "Absolutely, doctor. I will get this filled right away. Thank you for taking such good care of me." I stood up, shook the hand of the man who was sleeping with my wife, walked out of his opulent office, and made my way down the long, carpeted corridor. The receptionist wished me a good day, and I nodded politely, keeping the mask firmly in place. It was only when the heavy steel doors of the elevator closed, sealing me in the mirrored cab, that the facade finally cracked. I leaned against the cold metal railing, staring at my own pale reflection. My breathing grew ragged. The shock was rapidly receding, replaced by a terrifying, razor-sharp clarity. Valerie had not just found a younger, wealthier lover. She had found a doctor. And she had specifically maneuvered me, her aging husband, with a vulnerable heart condition, directly into his care. I pulled the prescription slip from my pocket, staring at the messy ink. The true horror of the situation suddenly crystallized in my mind, hitting me with the devastating force of a collapsing bridge. Why is the man sleeping with my wife aggressively treating my heart condition? I walked out of the towering glass building housing the clinic and stepped into the suffocating afternoon heat. The heavy doors closed behind me, locking the man who was sleeping with my wife away in his air-conditioned fortress. My car was parked 3 blocks down the street. Every step I took felt like I was walking through thick mud. The sheer weight of the betrayal pressed against my chest, making it difficult to draw a full breath. A normal man might have driven straight home in a blind rage. A normal man might have kicked the front door open, thrown the prescription on the kitchen island, and demanded answers from the woman he had loved for 35 years. But I am an engineer. I do not react to structural failures by screaming at the collapsing walls. I investigate the stress points. I calculate the damage. I find out exactly how the foundation was rigged to blow before I make a single move. I started the engine, but I did not head toward the affluent suburbs where Valerie was likely waiting for me. Instead, I merged onto the interstate and drove in the opposite direction. I drove 40 miles out of the city limits to a small, decaying neighboring town. I needed a place where nobody knew my face or my name. I needed a place where Valerie could not trace a credit card charge or casually ask a local technician about my visit. I pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of an old independent pharmacy. The neon sign above the door flickered with a dull green light, and the paint on the exterior walls was peeling away in large strips. It was the perfect place for a ghost. The bell above the glass door chimed as I walked inside. The store smelled of rubbing alcohol and old peppermint candy. Behind the raised counter stood a pharmacist who looked to be in his late 50s. He had thick glasses resting on the bridge of his nose and an expression of chronic exhaustion. I approached the counter and placed the folded slip of paper Dr. Pierce had given me onto the glass surface. I also handed him a thick manila folder containing the complete medical history of my heart condition. I told him I needed an independent consultation immediately. I pulled 5 $100 bills from my wallet and laid them flat next to the prescription. I told him I was paying completely out of pocket, and I wanted a thorough, brutal assessment of exactly what this new medication would do to a man with my specific cardiac profile. The pharmacist looked at the cash, then looked at my face. He did not ask any unnecessary questions. He took the money, opened my medical file, and began to read. For 10 long minutes, the only sound in the store was the hum of the fluorescent lights and the turning of paper pages. I watched his eyes scan my charts detailing the mild heart attack I had suffered 6 months ago. He read the notes about my blood pressure, my arterial walls, and my recovery progress. Then he picked up the prescription pad from Dr. Pierce. He adjusted his glasses, pushing them further up his nose. He read the chemical name written in the doctor's hurried, arrogant script. I watched the blood physically drain from the pharmacist's face. His hands stopped moving. He looked up at me and his eyes were wide with genuine terror. He asked me who exactly had prescribed this medication. I told him it was my new cardiologist at the prestigious downtown clinic. The pharmacist swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He told me that there had to be a catastrophic mistake. He explained that the drug written on that pad was an extreme-grade stimulant. It was a medication strictly utilized in emergency hospital settings for patients suffering from severe hypotensive shock. It was meant to aggressively and violently force the heart to pump harder and faster to rapidly raise blood pressure. I stood perfectly still, letting his words wash over me. I asked him what would happen if a man with my specific weakened heart condition took that drug daily. The pharmacist did not hesitate. He told me that with my recovering cardiac walls and my history of arterial stress, introducing this massive stimulant into my system would be like pouring rocket fuel into a failing engine. He said that my heart would accelerate to an uncontrollable, chaotic rate. Within 24 to 48 hours, the sheer mechanical strain would cause a massive, catastrophic myocardial infarction. My heart would literally tear itself apart from the inside out. I asked him if it would look suspicious to a medical examiner or a coroner. He shook his head slowly, looking at me with deep pity. He told me it would look exactly like a natural, tragic secondary heart attack, a common, unfortunate reality for a man of my age with a known cardiac history. Nobody would ask any questions. Nobody would demand an autopsy. The original doctor would simply sign the death certificate, citing inevitable natural heart failure. The walls of the pharmacy felt like they were closing in on me. I thanked the pharmacist for his honesty. I took my medical file back. I did not fill the prescription. Instead, I walked down the narrow, dusty aisles of the store until I found the section for daily vitamins and supplements. I needed something very specific. I spent 20 minutes meticulously comparing shapes, sizes, and colors. I finally found a generic brand of herbal supplements. They were chalky white, oval-shaped pills that were visually identical to the lethal medication Dr. Pierce had prescribed. I paid for the vitamins with the remaining cash in my pocket and walked back out to the stifling heat of the parking lot. I sat in the driver's seat, staring at the plastic bottle of vitamins resting in my lap. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, bloody streaks of orange and red across the windshield. The reality of my existence finally settled deep into my bones, replacing the shock with absolute horror. Valerie and her young, arrogant lover were not just having a sordid affair behind my back. They were not just waiting for me to naturally pass away so they could enjoy my life insurance and my savings. They were actively and intentionally executing me. They had designed a flawless, untraceable murder weapon, wrapped in a white lab coat and a forged medical necessity. My own wife, the woman who had kissed my cheek this morning, was going to smile at me over the dinner table while watching me swallow the poison she had helped procure. I thought about the house Valerie and I shared. I thought about the garden she tended and the meals we ate together. It was all a meticulously crafted stage play designed to keep me comfortable and blind. I realized that every kiss, every touch, every word of concern over the past 6 months had been a calculated performance. She had watched me clutch my chest in the hospital, pretending to cry while secretly wishing the monitor had flatlined right then and there. A profound, icy calm washed over my entire body. All the grief, all the sorrow of a 35-year marriage evaporating into nothingness was entirely replaced by a dark, metallic survival instinct. They thought I was a tired, naive old man, blindly trusting the woman who washed my clothes and cooked my meals. They thought they had backed me into a corner where my only exit was a wooden casket. They thought my heart was too weak to handle the truth. I opened the bottle of vitamins. I emptied the harmless white pills into the palm of my hand, feeling their chalky texture. If I confronted Valerie now, she would deny everything. She would cry, she would call me paranoid, and she would immediately alert Dr. Pierce. They would destroy the evidence. They would claim the prescription was a simple clerical error. And then they would find another way to finish the job. A tragic fall down the staircase. A fatal slip in the shower. I could not fight a war if the enemy knew I was armed and aware. I had to let them believe their flawless execution was going exactly as planned. I had to play the role of the dying husband to absolute perfection. I placed the vitamins into an empty amber prescription bottle I kept in my glove compartment. I threw the original vitamin packaging into a nearby public trash can, making sure no evidence of the swap remained. I gripped the steering wheel of my car, feeling the leather under my palms. I was no longer a husband returning to his loving wife. I was an engineer who had just found the fatal structural flaws in his enemy's fortress. They wanted to play a game of life and death. They wanted to bet my life for a massive financial payout. I put the car in gear and pulled out of the parking lot, heading back toward the city. I was going to go home. I was going to swallow their fake medicine with a grateful smile. And then I was going to systematically dismantle their entire world brick by brick until there was absolutely nothing left. The survival game had officially begun. The drive back to our quiet suburban neighborhood in Charlotte felt like a journey through an alien landscape. Every manicured lawn and perfectly trimmed hedge seemed like a mocking illusion. I pulled my car into the familiar concrete driveway and parked next to the pristine white sedan belonging to Valerie. For 35 years, this house had been my sanctuary. I had personally inspected the foundation before we bought it. I had built the wooden deck in the backyard where we hosted neighborhood barbecues. Now, looking at the brick facade in the fading evening light, I realized I was staring at a beautifully decorated slaughterhouse. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house smelled of roasted garlic and expensive vanilla candles. Valerie walked out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a linen towel. She wore a soft blue sweater that brought out the color of her eyes. She walked straight up to me, wrapped her arms around my neck, and planted a soft, sweet kiss on my cheek. She stepped back and looked at me with an expression of profound, manufactured concern. She asked me how the appointment with Dr. Pierce went, and if my heart was handling the stress of the day. I looked into the face of the woman who was actively coordinating my murder. I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I leaned into the performance with the precise calibration of a seasoned actor. I slumped my shoulders slightly, letting out a long, weary sigh. I told her that I was feeling incredibly tired and that the doctor said I needed more rest. I told her he had prescribed a new aggressive medication protocol to help manage my blood pressure spikes. A momentary flash of triumph passed through her eyes so quickly that anyone else would have missed it. She touched my arm gently and told me to go sit in my favorite recliner. She promised to bring me a plate of dinner and make sure I took my new medicine exactly as the brilliant doctor had ordered. I thanked her, playing the role of the fading dependent husband to absolute perfection. The evening dragged on with agonizing slowness. I ate the dinner she prepared. I swallowed the fake vitamin pill while she watched me with eager, attentive eyes. Finally, around midnight, she retreated to the master bedroom, claiming she needed her beauty sleep. I waited in the dark living room for a full hour, listening to the rhythmic sounds of the house settling. When I was absolutely certain she was in a deep sleep, I rose from my chair and walked silently down the carpeted hallway to my home office. I closed the heavy oak door behind me and turned on the small desk lamp. I booted up my computer. 6 months ago, right after my heart attack, I was lying in a hospital bed, feeling weak and terrified. Valerie had sat beside me, holding my hand, weeping softly. She told me that the stress of managing our complex financial portfolio was terrible for my blood pressure. She begged me to give her complete control over the banking passwords and the investment accounts so I could focus entirely on healing. I had handed over the keys to the work of my life without a single moment of hesitation, because I trusted my wife implicitly. I opened the secure banking portal, typed in the primary account details, and bypassed the security questions using the master recovery codes I had established decades ago. The loading screen spun for 3 agonizing seconds. When the dashboard finally materialized on the screen, my breathing completely stopped. The numbers staring back at me were a devastating bloodbath. The joint checking and savings accounts were completely hollowed out. But the true catastrophe was in our long-term investment portfolio. The robust mutual funds I had diligently funded with every engineering bonus and every hard-earned paycheck over 4 decades were completely decimated. It was a systematic and brutal financial hemorrhage. I clicked on the transaction history. My engineering mind immediately recognized the pattern. This was not a sudden, panicked robbery. This was a highly calculated, controlled demolition of my assets. Over the last 5 months, massive wire transfers had been funneled out of the portfolio. $20,000 here, $50,000 there. They had staggered the withdrawals perfectly to avoid triggering the automated fraud detection algorithms of the bank for massive sudden liquidations. In total, over $450,000 had been siphoned away into the ether. I leaned closer to the monitor, tracing the digital paper trail. Every single wire transfer was routed to a single external business account. The receiving entity was listed as a limited liability company registered under the name V&P Holdings. V&P, Valerie and Pierce. The sheer arrogance of the name made my stomach churn. They were not even trying to hide their partnership in the corporate filings. They had used my own money to create a joint financial entity while I was supposedly recovering from a near-fatal cardiac event. I needed to know exactly who was legally responsible for this company. I opened a new browser tab and navigated to the state government portal for public corporate registrations. I typed in V&P Holdings and paid the small processing fee to download the complete articles of organization. The document loaded onto my screen. I scrolled past the generic legal jargon and the registered agent details until I reached the section listing the managing directors. I expected to see Dr. Gavin Pierce. His name was there, printed clearly on the official document. But it was the second name on the list that struck me with a force far more lethal than any heart attack. The second managing director of V&P Holdings was Cameron Blake, my son, my 32-year-old son. I stared at the screen until the letters began to blur. The silence in my home office became deafening. This was the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle in the driveway outside this very window. This was the young man whose college tuition I had paid in full by working grueling 80-hour weeks analyzing concrete stress loads. I had bought him his first car. I had helped him secure the down payment for his house. The betrayal was so deep, so incomprehensibly evil, that it temporarily short-circuited my ability to process emotion. Cameron was not a passive bystander. He was not a victim of the manipulation of his mother. He was an active legal partner in a corporation designed entirely to launder the money stolen from my retirement accounts. My own flesh and blood was sitting in boardrooms and signing banking documents with the very man who was sleeping with his mother. I realized with a sickening clarity that Cameron knew exactly what was happening. He knew about the affair. He knew about the theft. And considering the lethal prescription sitting in my kitchen cabinet, he likely knew about the impending murder. My son was financing the infidelity of his mother and the execution of his father in exchange for a cut of the profits. I printed the corporate registration documents and the complete transaction history of the bank. The printer hummed quietly in the corner, spitting out page after page of undeniable proof. I gathered the warm sheets of paper and placed them into a thick, secure folder. I locked the folder inside the bottom drawer of my heavy metal filing cabinet. I turned off the computer and sat in the dark office. They had murdered the loving father and husband who once inhabited this house, but they had forgotten that I am a structural engineer. I know exactly how to find the weak points in any foundation, and I was going to bring their entire world crashing down on their heads. The aroma of seared ribeye steak and roasted garlic potatoes drifted down the hallway, filling the house with a deceptive warmth. It was my favorite meal. For over 3 decades, that specific scent meant we were celebrating something special. A promotion at the engineering firm, a successful bridge project, an anniversary. Tonight, however, the celebration belonged entirely to my wife. She was cooking a victory dinner. She just did not realize she was the only one celebrating. I walked into the kitchen, leaning slightly heavily on my feet to maintain the illusion of my declining health. Valerie was standing by the granite countertop, humming a soft, cheerful melody. She wore a pristine white apron over a dark blue dress. She looked beautiful. She looked like the devoted partner I had cherished for more than half my life. It was a terrifying realization to understand that the human brain can perfectly compartmentalize pure evil behind a domestic smile. I took my seat at the head of the heavy oak dining table, a piece of furniture I had purchased with my first major consulting bonus. Valerie turned around, holding a platter of steaming food. She placed a generous cut of perfectly cooked meat in front of me alongside a mountain of golden potatoes. She poured a tall glass of ice water and set it gently near my right hand. Then she did it. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out the amber plastic prescription bottle, the bottle that supposedly contained the lethal stimulant Dr. Pierce had ordered. She placed it squarely next to my water glass, aligning it perfectly with my plate. Her voice was smooth, like honey pouring over broken glass. "Do not forget your new medication, Warren. Dr. Pierce said it is absolutely crucial that you take it with a heavy meal to help your heart absorb it properly." I looked at the amber bottle. Inside were the chalky white herbal supplements I had swapped yesterday afternoon, but to her eyes that plastic cylinder held the key to her freedom. It held the key to a massive life insurance payout and a destination wedding in the Bahamas with her younger lover. I looked up from the bottle and met her gaze. Her eyes were wide, bright, and filled with a manufactured concern that made my stomach churn. I reached out with a hand I deliberately forced to tremble just a fraction. I picked up the bottle, unscrewed the child-proof cap, and shook one of the white oval pills into my palm. I looked at it for a long second, letting the silence stretch across the dining room. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I raised my eyes to hers. I smiled, a tired, grateful smile of an aging man who completely trusts his wife. "Thank you, Valerie," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I really do not know what I would do without you taking such good care of me. You are my angel." I placed the fake vitamin on my tongue, picked up the glass of ice water, and swallowed it down. I set the glass back on the table and let out a satisfied sigh. A profound wave of relaxation washed over her posture. Her shoulders dropped slightly. Her smile reached the corners of her eyes. She took her seat at the opposite end of the table, cutting into her own meal, with a sudden renewed appetite. We ate in relative silence for the first 10 minutes. The clinking of silver forks against porcelain plates echoed in the room. I chewed my food methodically, tasting absolutely nothing. The steak could have been ash, and I would not have noticed. My entire biological system was operating on adrenaline and calculated strategy. I was waiting for the perfect moment to test the absolute limit of her depravity. I needed to know, with absolute certainty, what she would do when the poison she thought she had given me finally took effect. I needed to witness the monster without her mask. Halfway through the meal, I stopped chewing. I dropped my fork loudly onto the plate, allowing it to clatter against the ceramic. I suddenly grabbed the edge of the heavy oak table with both hands, squeezing the wood, until my knuckles turned stark white. I sucked in a sharp, ragged gasp of air, forcing my breathing to become immediately shallow and panicked. I squeezed my eyes shut, contorting my face into a mask of sudden, excruciating agony. I pressed my right hand hard against the center of my chest, digging my fingers into my shirt. "Valerie," I choked out, letting my voice break into a desperate rasp. "Valerie, something is wrong. My chest." I slumped forward in my chair, knocking over my water glass. The ice cubes scattered across the polished wood, and the cold water dripped onto my lap. I kept my breathing erratic, loud, and desperate. I was giving an award-winning performance of a man experiencing a massive, catastrophic cardiac failure. Through my squinted, partially closed eyes, I observed the woman sitting across the table from me. I expected panic. Even from a murderer, I expected a moment of hesitation, a sudden realization of the finality of death. I expected her to perhaps fake a panicked phone call to emergency services just to cover her tracks. She did none of those things. Valerie did not scream. She did not jump out of her chair. She did not reach into her pocket for her cellular phone to dial 911. She simply stopped cutting her steak. She placed her knife and fork neatly on the edges of her plate. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest. And she watched me. The expression on her face was something I will carry with me to my grave. It was a look of cold, clinical fascination. There was no pity. There was no terror. There was only the calculating patience of a predator watching a wounded animal bleed out in the grass. She tilted her head slightly to the side as if she were inspecting a painting she did not quite understand. She was waiting for me to hit the floor. She was waiting for my eyes to roll back and my breathing to stop forever. She was counting the seconds until she was a wealthy widow. The sheer absolute evil of her stillness was far more terrifying than if she had plunged a knife into my heart herself. I let the performance drag on for another 10 agonizing seconds. I groaned, clutching my shirt, letting my head drop lower toward the table. She remained perfectly silent, a marble statue of greed. Slowly, I began to ease the tension in my body. I let out a long, trembling exhale. I loosened my grip on my chest and sat back up in my chair, blinking rapidly, as if the room were coming back into focus. I reached for a napkin and wiped my forehead, which was genuinely damp from the intense physical exertion of the act. I took a deep, shaky breath and offered her an embarrassed, apologetic smile. "I am so sorry, darling," I wheezed, forcing a nervous chuckle. "It was just heartburn. Severe heartburn. I think the roasted garlic was a bit too much for me tonight. The new medication must be making my stomach a little sensitive. I am fine. Really, I am perfectly fine." The transformation in her face was instantaneous and horrifying. The cold, patient observation shattered. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes narrowed into tiny dark slits. The disappointment radiating from her was so palpable it felt like a sudden drop in the room temperature. She had been seconds away from inheriting a fortune and booking a first-class ticket to the Bahamas. Instead, her husband was sitting back up and making jokes about garlic potatoes. She took a deep, steadying breath, forcing the domestic mask back onto her face. It was a sloppy attempt. Her smile was tight, and her voice carried a sharp, brittle edge. "You terrified me, Warren. You really terrified me. You should be more careful. If you are feeling unwell, you need to go rest immediately. I nodded, picking up my napkin to clean the spilled water. You are right, my love. I think I will skip the rest of dinner and go lie down. Thank you for cooking. It was delicious. I pushed my chair back and stood up, maintaining a slow, shuffling gait as I walked out of the dining room. I did not look back, but I could feel her eyes burning into my spine. As I reached the end of the hallway, I heard the violent scrape of her chair being pushed back and the harsh clatter of her sweeping the dinner plates into the sink. She was furious. The poison had supposedly failed or was taking too long. I walked into the master bedroom and closed the door silently. I sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the wall. The game was no longer a theory. It was no longer a collection of suspicious bank transfers and forged prescriptions. I had just watched my wife sit in absolute silence, waiting for me to die right in front of her. The final shred of mercy I held for the mother of my son completely evaporated in that dining room. They were not just greedy, they were ruthless. But they were about to learn that an engineer does not just build structures. An engineer knows exactly how to trigger a controlled demolition. And tomorrow I was going to find out exactly how deep my son's involvement in this execution truly went. The morning sun poured through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. Valerie walked into the room wearing her expensive designer workout clothes. She kissed my cheek lightly, leaving a trace of her floral perfume in the air. She told me she was heading to the gym for a few hours and reminded me to take it easy. She flashed me that same perfect manufactured smile she had worn the night before and walked out the front door. I stood by the window watching her white sedan reverse out of the driveway and disappear down the street. She was likely heading straight to the arms of Dr. Pierce to complain about how my stubborn heart was refusing to stop beating. The moment her car turned the corner, the fragile domestic illusion evaporated. I was entirely alone in the house. I grabbed my car keys and walked out to the garage. My target was 20 miles away, in an upscale gated community. It was a beautiful, sprawling colonial house that I had personally helped secure. 5 years ago, when my son Cameron wanted to buy his first real home, his tech startup was barely generating any revenue. The bank refused to approve his mortgage application. I did not hesitate. I transferred a massive portion of my personal savings to cover his 20% down payment. I wanted my son and his new wife Natalie to start their lives on a solid foundation. I thought I was investing in my family. I thought I was building a legacy. As I drove down the interstate, gripping the leather steering wheel, I realized I had merely purchased the headquarters for my own assassination. I pulled into the quiet suburban street and parked my car 2 blocks away from Cameron's property. I did not want my vehicle sitting in their pristine driveway to announce my arrival. I walked the remaining distance, feeling the morning humidity press against my skin. The neighborhood was completely silent, save for the distant hum of a landscaping crew a few streets over. I approached the heavy wooden front door of their house. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the brass spare key Cameron had given me years ago for emergencies. He told me I was always welcome in his home. He never imagined I would actually take him up on the offer on a random Wednesday morning. I slid the key into the deadbolt. I turned it with agonizing slowness, making sure the internal metal tumblers did not click too loudly. The door swung open silently on its well-oiled hinges. I stepped into the grand foyer and closed the door behind me with the same calculated precision. The house smelled of expensive espresso and underlying tension. From the back of the house, I heard the distinct muffled sounds of an argument. I walked down the long carpeted hallway, stepping carefully to avoid the floorboards I knew were prone to creaking. I had helped install that flooring when they first moved in. I knew exactly where the structural weak points were. As I approached the open archway leading into their massive designer kitchen, the voices became sharp and clear. I pressed my back flat against the cool painted drywall of the hallway, completely hidden from their line of sight. I regulated my breathing, slowing it down until I was as silent as a ghost in my own son's house. Natalie was pacing across the tiled floor. Her voice was shrill, brittle, and laced with mounting panic. She was talking about money. She was aggressively listing out their financial failures. She mentioned 3 different credit cards that were completely maxed out, and a final notice they had received from a private lending institution. Her tone was not just stressed, it was venomous. She slammed a ceramic coffee mug onto the granite countertop with a loud, harsh crack. She yelled that they were drowning and that they needed the cash infusion immediately. Then she said the words that will echo in my mind for the rest of my life. "Your mother said it would be done by Tuesday," Natalie snapped, her voice echoing off the kitchen cabinets. "He started the new pills yesterday. How long does a bad heart take to give out?" I closed my eyes and pressed the back of my head against the drywall. The sheer casual cruelty of her statement was breathtaking. She was not talking about a human life. She was not talking about the man who had paid for the very roof over her head. She was tracking my impending death, like a delayed bank transfer. She was irritated that my heart was taking too long to tear itself apart, because the billing cycle on her credit cards was coming to an end. I waited for my son to defend me. I waited for some microscopic shred of human decency to surface in the boy I had raised. I waited for him to tell his wife to stop talking about his father that way. Instead, I heard Cameron let out a long, frustrated sigh. He told her to lower her voice. He did not sound angry at her horrific words. He sounded exhausted by her impatience. Cameron told her she needed to calm down and trust the process. He assured her that the medical plan his mother and the doctor had put together was absolutely foolproof. He told Natalie that as soon as the coroner signed the death certificate, the life insurance company would automatically release the $1.5 million payout directly into the accounts of V&P Holdings. He explained with cold corporate detachment that once the money hit the limited liability company, their predetermined cut was $200,000. He promised her that the money would be transferred to them cleanly and that it was more than enough to save his failing startup business and wipe out their personal debt. There it was. The absolute unfiltered truth stripped of all its domestic lies. My son had not been tricked or manipulated by Valerie. He was a willing, eager participant in my execution. He had looked at his father, his provider, his protector, and placed a price tag of $200,000 on my head. He had literally sold my life to fund a business bailout for his empty, hollow tech company. He traded my heartbeat to pay off his wife's luxury credit card bills. A deep, profound emptiness expanded inside my chest. It was a void so massive it threatened to swallow me whole. But the engineer inside me, the survivor, simply analyzed the new data and adjusted the demolition plan. I did not need to hear another word. I had obtained the absolute confirmation I came for. I turned around and walked back down the carpeted hallway with the silent, deliberate steps of an apex predator tracking its prey. I reached the front door, turned the brass handle, and slipped out into the warm morning air. I locked the deadbolt behind me, leaving no trace that I had ever been there. I walked the 2 blocks back to my parked car, my vision perfectly clear, my hands completely steady. I sat in the driver's seat and stared at the steering wheel for a long time. They thought I was a fragile old man waiting to die in a recliner. They thought they had perfectly calculated the load-bearing limits of my existence. They were entirely wrong. I put the car in gear and drove away from the house I had bought for the son who wanted me dead. I was going to obliterate them. I drove away from the quiet suburban street where my son lived, feeling a chilling clarity settle over my mind. The emotional shockwave of the morning had completely dissipated. The crushing grief of hearing my own child calculate the timeline of my death had burned away, leaving behind only the cold, hard calculus of survival. I knew I could not fight a network of enemies alone. My wife had the medical expertise and the prescription pad of her younger lover to rely on. My son had his youth, his desperate greed, and his corporate banking structures. They were organized, motivated, and completely stripped of any moral hesitation. I needed an architect of destruction to help me dismantle them. I needed someone who operated far outside the polite, gentle boundaries of standard family law. I merged onto the highway and drove to the opposite side of the city, heading toward a high-security corporate office park, hidden behind heavy steel gates and tinted glass facades. This was where the real wars were fought. I navigated the labyrinth of polished marble corridors until I reached a set of unmarked frosted glass double doors. I was there to see Owen Carter. Owen was not a family attorney who held your hand, offered you a tissue, and talked about amicable mediations and fair settlements. He was a ruthless former corporate litigator who specialized in high-stakes asset recovery and dismantling complex financial fraud. He was a legal mercenary, and he was exactly the weapon I needed to survive the week. The receptionist escorted me into a massive corner office that overlooked the sprawling city skyline. Owen sat behind a thick concrete desk, looking like a man who had not slept a full night in a decade, but functioned entirely on caffeine and aggression. He had sharp, predatory eyes and wore a tailored suit that projected absolute authority. He did not offer me empty platitudes or ask how my day was going. He simply pointed to the heavy leather chair opposite him and asked me why I had requested an emergency consultation. I sat down and opened the leather briefcase I had brought with me. I did not speak at first. I let the physical evidence do the talking. I reached into the bag and pulled out the amber plastic bottle containing the fake vitamins. I placed it squarely in the center of his desk. Next to it, I laid the independent pharmacy laboratory report detailing the exact chemical nature of the lethal stimulant Dr. Pierce had prescribed. Owen leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he read the complex chemical breakdown and the intended fatal effect it would have on my specific recovering heart condition. Then I pulled out the financial records. I laid out the printed bank statements highlighting the $450,000 in staggered wire transfers that had vanished from my retirement accounts over the last 5 months. Finally, I placed the public registration documents for V&P Holdings right beside the bank records. I tapped my finger firmly on the managing director's signatures belonging to my wife's lover and my own son. I sat back in my chair and watched him process the information. Owen picked up the documents one by one. The silence in the office was absolute. He did not show shock or pity. He analyzed the materials with the exact same mechanical precision I used to evaluate a failing suspension bridge. When he finally looked up at me, his expression was completely devoid of warmth, but filled with a profound, terrifying, professional respect. He told me that my family had constructed a remarkably efficient criminal enterprise. He said that the seamless combination of medical assassination and corporate embezzlement was something he usually only saw in federal organized crime cases. He placed the papers back down on the desk and folded his hands. He told me that if I had confronted my wife last night or filed for a standard divorce this morning, I would likely be dead by tomorrow afternoon. A divorce proceeding would legally notify them that I was fully aware of their actions. It would freeze the marital assets and trigger a mandatory disclosure process. Owen explained that giving Valerie and her doctor that kind of legal warning would provide them with the immediate desperate incentive to accelerate their timeline. They would force a fatal medical accident or a tragic domestic fall before the court could intervene. A standard divorce would simply be a suicide note. Owen stood up and walked over to a large glass whiteboard mounted on the wall. He picked up a marker and began to map out the conspiracy. He drew connecting lines between the medical fraud, the financial theft, and the corporate money laundering. He told me that to win this war, we could not just attack one single pillar of their foundation. If we only went after the stolen money, they would still try to kill me to silence the investigation. If we only went to the police with the lethal pills, they would use the stolen funds to hire elite defense attorneys and claim it was a harmless pharmaceutical mix-up. He looked at me with a cold, calculating intensity. He said we had to strike them simultaneously on the legal, financial, and criminal fronts. We had to trigger a total systemic collapse of their entire operation, all at the exact same moment. To do that, we needed to immediately secure my remaining untouchable assets. The money they had already stolen was currently sitting in their fraudulent corporate accounts, giving them a false sense of absolute security. But they did not yet have their hands on my structural engineering business shares. or the deed to my house which was fully paid off and held solely in my name. Owen explained that Valerie and Cameron were undoubtedly waiting for my heart to stop, so those massive physical and corporate assets would fall smoothly into probate. As my grieving widow and my tragic orphaned son, they could easily liquidate those assets once I was buried. Owen moved back to his desk and began typing rapidly on his computer keyboard. He told me he was drafting the paperwork for an irrevocable blind trust. He described it as a titanium legal vault. By transferring my business equity and the deed of the house into this specific trust, I would effectively remove my personal name from the direct ownership records. I would remain the sole beneficiary of the trust, but Owen would act as the appointed legal trustee. He printed the thick stack of legal documents and laid them out in front of me. He explained that once the ink was dry, my family would not be able to touch a single brick of my house or a single share of my company, even if my heart stopped beating right in front of them. The assets would be completely insulated from any spouse or heir. They would be legally blocked from selling the house or touching my life's work. I picked up the heavy brass pen from his desk. I felt the smooth metal between my fingers. I was no longer a victim waiting for the poison to take effect. I was the architect of their destruction. I signed my name on the dotted lines, locking my legacy away and setting the trap that would eventually bury them all. The evening air was thick and humid as I drove back to the house holding the heavy burden of my discoveries. Every street corner and manicured lawn in our affluent neighborhood looked like a painted backdrop on a theater stage hiding a dark, rotting reality behind its beautiful facade. I pulled my car into the driveway, alongside Valerie's pristine white vehicle. For 35 years, I had walked up this concrete path, feeling the deep, comforting satisfaction of a man returning to his sanctuary. Tonight, I was a soldier stepping across enemy lines. I took a slow, deliberate breath, preparing my body to perform the most critical role of my entire life. I let my shoulders slump forward, transferring my weight to simulate the profound, exhausting weakness of a dying man. I opened the front door and stepped into the foyer. The house smelled of expensive vanilla candles and citrus, a perfectly curated atmosphere of domestic bliss that made my stomach churn with absolute disgust. Valerie was sitting at the massive granite kitchen island, looking like a vision of suburban perfection. She wore a sleek silk blouse that draped elegantly over her shoulders, and she was casually sipping a glass of imported white wine. When she heard my slow, shuffling footsteps, she closed her laptop screen with a swift, practiced motion. She turned to me, offering that same radiant, manufactured smile that had successfully blinded me for decades. I shuffled into the kitchen, dragging my feet across the polished hardwood floor, projecting the image of a fragile old man whose biological clock was rapidly running out of time. She asked me in a voice dripping with fake honey if I was feeling strong enough to handle a very minor piece of administrative paperwork before I went upstairs to rest. I pulled out one of the heavy wooden bar stools and sat down, letting out a long, deliberate sigh that rattled in my chest. I told her I was incredibly tired, but that I was always willing to help her with whatever she needed to keep our household running smoothly. She stood up and walked over to my side of the island, carrying a thick stack of stapled legal documents and a heavy silver fountain pen. Her posture was relaxed and casual, but her eyes betrayed a sharp, predatory focus that locked directly onto my face. She placed the papers gently on the cool granite surface right in front of me, tapping the top page with her perfectly manicured fingernail. She spoke in a soothing, maternal tone, telling me that our longtime insurance broker had called earlier in the afternoon. She claimed the brokerage firm was updating all of their internal digital filing systems and desperately needed my updated physical signature to authorize a completely routine policy adjustment on my life insurance file. She promised me it was just a tedious corporate formality to ensure my premium rates remained locked, and that I absolutely did not need to worry my weak recovering heart over the boring legal details. I looked down at the crisp white pages resting on the counter. The top sheet was a standard cover letter filled with dense bureaucratic jargon designed specifically to make a tired reader lose interest and skip directly to the signature line at the bottom. but I am a structural engineer. I have spent my entire professional life reading complex schematics and searching for microscopic stress fractures that could bring down massive steel bridges. I never skip the fine print. I slowly turned the cover page using a trembling hand to maintain my physical facade. The second page was the actual legal instrument, and the bold black text at the top of the document immediately made the blood freeze in my veins. It was not a routine policy adjustment or a simple address update. It was a comprehensive, irrevocable change of beneficiary form. I stared at the paperwork, letting my eyes scan the meticulously drafted paragraphs while keeping my face completely blank. For the past 20 years, the sole beneficiary of my $1,500,000 life insurance policy had been a secure family trust. I had sacrificed and worked grueling 80-hour weeks to pay those massive premiums, ensuring that Valerie and Cameron would be provided for over a long structured period if anything ever happened to me. But the new document sitting in front of me completely dissolved that protective legal structure. The new primary beneficiary listed on the official transfer line was an entity I now knew intimately. The entire sum of the $1,500,000 was being redirected entirely and directly into the corporate accounts of V&P Holdings. The sheer monumental audacity of her plan crystallized perfectly in my mind. Valerie and her young doctor lover, along with my traitorous son, were playing a highly calculated game of legal chess. If my damaged heart finally gave out tomorrow, and I died leaving the original family trust in place, the massive payout would immediately be tied up in complex probate courts. A judge would freeze the assets, and an independent legal executor would investigate the disbursement of the funds over many months. They would never be able to access the cash quickly enough to pay off my son's massive hidden debts or fund their lavish destination wedding in the Bahamas. They needed clean, untraceable liquid cash dropped directly into their fraudulent limited liability company the very moment my death certificate was signed by Dr. Pierce. To achieve that seamless transfer, they absolutely needed my living legal signature authorizing the change before their poison finally stopped my heart. Valerie was hovering right over my shoulder, her expensive perfume masking the scent of pure greed. She uncapped the silver fountain pen and pressed it gently into my right hand, wrapping my fingers around the cool metal. She pointed to the bottom of the page, showing me exactly where I needed to sign my life away. She whispered sweetly, telling me to just sign quickly so I could go upstairs and get my much-needed sleep. I took the heavy pen, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on my shoulders. I knew that if I refused to sign, she would instantly know that I had read the fine print. She would realize the ignorant dying husband was actually fully aware of the trap. That would trigger a panic, and they might resort to a more immediate violent method to end my life tonight. I had to render the document completely useless without giving her any reason to suspect deliberate sabotage. I lowered the tip of the pen toward the signature line. Just as the black ink touched the white paper, I suddenly threw my entire body forward, violently slamming my chest against the edge of the granite island. I squeezed my eyes shut and let out a harsh, jagged, hacking cough that echoed loudly through the kitchen. I convulsed my shoulders, throwing my right arm wildly across the table. The silver fountain pen dragged aggressively across the crisp paper. I gasped for air, making horrible, wet, choking sounds deep in my throat, as if my lungs were collapsing. I allowed my hand to shake uncontrollably, leaving a chaotic, jagged, illegible trail of black ink completely outside the designated signature box. I smeared the wet ink with my palm, dragging it across to the important legal clauses, ruining the integrity of the entire page. I slumped back into the wooden stool, gripping my chest and panting heavily, as if I had just survived a massive, sudden biological failure. I looked up at Valerie with wide, terrified eyes, apologizing profusely for ruining her important paperwork. I gasped out that the new medication was making my chest feel incredibly tight and causing these terrible, sudden physical spasms. I watched her face closely through my squinted eyes. The mask of the loving, caring wife slipped completely, revealing a flash of absolute venomous disgust. She looked down at the ruined document with pure, naked hatred. My violent performance had resulted in a massive dark ink stain and a chaotic scribble that looked absolutely nothing like my official legal signature. A bank or an insurance company would instantly reject it as a corrupted, damaged file lacking any clear intent of authorization. Valerie snatched the paper off the counter with a sharp, aggressive movement, wrinkling the edges in her fist. She took a deep, calming breath, struggling to hide her immense frustration. She forced her jaw to relax and told me through gritted teeth that it was perfectly fine and that she would just have the broker process the messy page anyway. She truly believed she had secured the authorization she needed to steal my life savings. She did not realize that the illegible scribble I had just provided was entirely legally void, completely destroying her path to my fortune. I slowly pushed myself up from the stool, leaning heavily on the counter to support my fake weakness. I told her I was going to bed. I walked down the hallway, leaving her standing alone in the kitchen, clutching a worthless piece of paper. The deadly trap had been effectively neutralized, and she had absolutely no idea that I was already planning my next move. I needed to completely surrender to the illusion of my own destruction. The morning after the forged signature incident, I drove to a local medical supply store on the edge of town and purchased a thick wooden walking cane. It was a heavy, ugly thing with a dull rubber base. When I returned to the house, I did not walk through the front door with my usual posture. I dragged my feet. I let my shoulders collapse inward, compressing my chest to simulate a man whose heart was actively giving up the fight. I began to shuffle across the hardwood floors, letting the rubber tip of the cane scrape loudly against the varnish. I wanted Valerie to hear the sound of my physical deterioration echoing through the hallways. I wanted the sound of that cane to be the soundtrack to her victory. She watched me struggle to walk from the kitchen to the living room, and I could see the absolute thrill radiating from her eyes. She genuinely believed the lethal stimulant she thought I was taking was finally tearing my cardiac walls apart. I committed to the performance with the exact same obsessive dedication I used when designing the structural supports of a skyscraper. I stopped grooming myself. I let my silver beard grow out into a messy, uneven shadow. I stopped wearing my tailored suits and began dressing in loose, wrinkled sweatpants and faded cotton shirts that hung off my frame, making me look gaunt and defeated. I forced my hands to shake every time I picked up a glass of water or a piece of silverware. But the most important part of my strategy was my deliberate absence. I began to spend 18 hours a day isolated in the master bedroom. I would lie on top of the mattress with the curtains drawn tight, plunging the room into absolute darkness. I slowed my breathing until it sounded like the shallow, ragged gasps of a man living on borrowed time. Valerie would peek her head through the doorway, occasionally watching my chest rise and fall with a cold, clinical detachment. Whenever she entered the room, I would keep my eyes closed, acting as though the heavy medication had completely severed my connection to the conscious world. My calculated silence bred absolute arrogance in my enemies. Predators are always the most vulnerable when they believe their prey is already dead. Because Valerie thought I was locked in a deep medicated coma, she completely abandoned all of her previous caution. The quiet whispered phone calls in the backyard stopped. She began walking freely through the house, talking loudly to Dr. Pierce about catering options and floral arrangements for their tropical wedding. Her arrogance became an infection that quickly spread to the rest of the conspirators. 2 days later, Cameron and his wife Natalie came over to the house for an unannounced evening visit. In the past, they would have sat politely in the dining room, maintaining the fragile illusion of a loving family checking on their sick patriarch. Tonight, however, they did not even bother to lower their voices or close the doors. I lay still in the dark bedroom, keeping my door cracked open just a fraction of an inch to allow their voices to drift down the hallway. I heard the clinking of crystal glasses echoing from my own living room. I listened closely, recognizing the distinct heavy thud of the crystal decanter hitting the coffee table. Cameron had gone into my private study and opened my collection of rare imported scotch. He was pouring generous glasses of a 30-year-old single malt whiskey that I had saved for a special occasion. He was drinking to celebrate my impending funeral using my own premium liquor. The sheer audacity of their behavior was breathtaking. They were sitting on my leather sofas, drinking my expensive scotch and comfortably making themselves at home while they waited for my heart to stop. I could hear Natalie laughing, a loud, shrill sound that bounced off the walls. She told Valerie that the new diamond earrings she had bought with the latest bank transfer were absolutely perfect for the humid weather of the islands. They were openly discussing the spoils of their financial theft without a single ounce of fear. They believed the thick wooden door and my supposed chemical coma provided a perfect soundproof barrier. They believed I was deaf to the world, oblivious to the monsters sitting 50 feet away from my bed. I did not let my anger compromise my tactical position. I reached under my pillow and pulled out my cellular phone. I opened the voice recording application and pressed the large record button. I carefully slid the device toward the crack in the doorway, ensuring the microphone was perfectly positioned to capture every single word echoing down the hallway. I lay back against the mattress, staring up at the dark ceiling, while the digital counter on the screen silently documented my family digging their own graves. The audio was incredibly crisp. I recorded Valerie complaining about how difficult it was to book the premium beachfront villas for their specific wedding dates in the Bahamas. She told Cameron that Dr. Pierce was getting impatient because they needed the final life insurance payout to secure the luxury yacht rental for the reception. Cameron confidently assured his mother that the payout was imminent. He laughed, taking a long sip of my scotch, and joked that my weak engineering heart could not possibly handle another weekend of the heavy medication. He proudly stated that V&P Holdings was fully prepared to receive the wire transfer the moment the death certificate was signed. Then the conversation shifted to a detail that made my blood run entirely cold. Natalie changed the subject to their immediate social calendar. She excitedly asked Valerie if all the invitations had been confirmed for the upcoming engagement party this Saturday. My wife enthusiastically replied that over 100 guests had submitted their formal reservations. Valerie bragged that she had successfully booked the Grand Terrace at the most exclusive high-end country club in the entire city. The very same country club where I had been a premium member for over 2 decades. I listened as Cameron asked his mother how she managed to pay the massive upfront deposit required for such a prestigious venue. Valerie laughed, a cruel, dismissive sound that made my stomach churn. She proudly admitted that she simply utilized the $450,000 they had systematically drained from my retirement accounts. She bragged that the stolen money had easily covered the extravagant catering, the live jazz band, and the imported champagne for the entire guest list. They were throwing a massive, lavish celebration of their deceit, and they were funding the entire criminal enterprise with the money I had worked 40 years to earn. I reached out and stopped the recording. The digital file was safely stored away, providing an undeniable ironclad record of their entire conspiracy. I had captured them confessing to the financial theft, the medical assassination plot, and the upcoming celebration funded by my stolen retirement accounts. I lay in the dark room listening to the clinking of their glasses and the sound of their arrogant laughter echoing down the hall. They thought this Saturday was going to be the crowning achievement of their flawless criminal plan. They thought they were going to drink imported champagne on a beautiful terrace surrounded by wealthy socialites entirely untouched by consequence. They had absolutely no idea that the frail dying man lying in the dark bedroom was carefully tracking their every move. They did not know that my structural business shares and the deed to the very house they were sitting in were already locked away in an impenetrable blind trust. They did not know that my ruthless legal ally, Owen Carter, was already preparing the financial and legal strikes that would bring their entire world crashing down. I closed my eyes, feeling a powerful surge of cold, calculated adrenaline pumping through my perfectly healthy heart. Let them drink my expensive scotch tonight. Let them plan their tropical wedding and their luxurious country club engagement party. Because this coming Saturday, The dying old man was going to attend that celebration, and I was going to turn their beautiful terrace party into a spectacular public demolition. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when I slipped out of the master bedroom. I left a mound of pillows arranged under the heavy duvet to create the illusion of my sleeping body. Valerie was downstairs brewing her imported coffee, completely unaware that the man she was trying to execute was quietly walking out the back door. I did not take my usual vehicle. I had rented an unremarkable gray sedan a few days prior, paying entirely in cash and parking it 3 streets over. I drove through the quiet suburban neighborhoods, feeling the cool morning air rushing through the open windows. The oppressive, suffocating atmosphere of my own house faded into the distance. Today, I was not a victim. Today, I was sealing the vault. I arrived at the towering glass building housing the law firm of Owen Carter. The underground parking garage was cold and perfectly silent. I rode the private elevator up to the top floor, stepping out into the immaculate reception area. Owen was already waiting for me in his massive corner office. He was wearing a sharp-tailored suit and holding a stack of thick legal documents that represented the absolute destruction of my family. I sat down in the heavy leather chair across from his desk. The surface was made of polished concrete, a fittingly cold and impenetrable material for the work we were about to do. Owen slid the thick stack of papers toward me. He handed me a heavy brass pen. He did not offer any false sympathy. He simply explained the mechanics of the legal fortification we were building. The documents in front of me established an irrevocable blind trust. It was a complex and incredibly aggressive legal structure designed to completely sever my personal identity from my physical and financial assets. By signing these pages, I was willingly transferring the legal ownership of my entire life into a protected fortress. I read through the clauses, carefully applying the same rigorous scrutiny I used when inspecting the steel joints of a suspension bridge. The first section transferred the deed to my suburban home, the very same house where Valerie was currently drinking her morning coffee, plotting my demise with her lover. The second section transferred the titles to my 2 vintage restored automobiles. But the most critical section involved my life work. I transferred 100% of my equity in the structural engineering firm I had spent 40 years building from the ground up. I surrendered all direct control. I became the sole beneficiary of the trust, while Owen Carter assumed the role of the legally appointed trustee. I pressed the tip of the brass pen to the paper. I did not hesitate. I signed my name with firm, deliberate strokes on page after page. With every signature, I felt a massive, heavy chain falling away from my shoulders. The trap was officially set. If my heart actually failed tomorrow, or if Valerie managed to slip a fatal dose of her poison into my food, she would inherit absolutely nothing. My wife and my traitorous son would be left staring at an impenetrable legal wall. The trust was legally immune to any power of attorney they tried to forge and completely shielded from the probate courts they hoped to manipulate. The assets were locked in a vault they could not even see, let alone break into. Owen collected the signed documents, verifying each page with clinical efficiency. He placed them into a thick leather portfolio. Then he turned his attention to his sleek computer monitor. It was time for the second phase of the operation. We had secured my remaining assets, but we still needed to neutralize the $450,000 they had already stolen. Owen opened a secure encrypted portal connected directly to the federal banking oversight authorities. He explained his strategy in a calm, low voice. We were not going to simply ask the bank to return the funds. That would trigger a lengthy corporate dispute. Instead, Owen was filing an emergency injunction, flagging the entire series of wire transfers as a coordinated act of federal wire fraud and elder financial exploitation. He attached the forged corporate documents from the shell company, along with the audio recordings I had captured. He submitted the injunction directly to the fraud division of the Central Banking Authority. I watched his fingers move rapidly across the keyboard. He hit a final button, and the screen confirmed the submission. Owen looked up at me and nodded. The digital strike had been executed. Within minutes, the automated security algorithms at the central bank would receive the federal fraud alert. The system would instantly and mercilessly lock every single account associated with the fraudulent corporate entity known as V&P Holdings. The $450,000 was now trapped in a frozen digital purgatory. Valerie and the arrogant cardiologist would not be able to withdraw a single penny. They would not be able to transfer the funds to an offshore account or use the money to pay down the massive debts my son had accumulated. The bank would refuse any transactions, blocking all access until a full federal investigation was completed. My money was out of their reach forever. I leaned back in the leather chair, feeling a profound, dark satisfaction blooming in my chest. The architectural integrity of their criminal enterprise had just suffered a catastrophic structural failure. I thought about Valerie and her younger lover. At this exact moment, they were likely waking up in a luxurious hotel suite or sitting in a high-end cafe, completely oblivious to the digital guillotine that had just severed their financial heads. They believed they were wealthy. They believed their flawless murder plot had successfully secured their lavish future. They were currently making the final preparations for their massive engagement party at the country club. I pictured Valerie calling the expensive florists to confirm the imported orchids. I imagined the doctor tasting sample menus with the high-end caterers making arrogant demands about the quality of the champagne. They were acting like royalty, entirely fueled by the false confidence of my stolen retirement savings. The dramatic irony of the situation was absolute perfection. They had absolutely no idea that their corporate accounts were completely frozen. They did not know that the credit cards associated with their shell company would bounce the next time they tried to purchase a luxury item. They were completely and utterly broke. They were preparing to host a lavish, extravagant celebration of their deceit for hundreds of wealthy socialites, and they could no longer afford to pay for a single napkin. I stood up from the heavy leather chair and shook hands with my ruthless legal ally. Owen assured me that the trust was airtight, and the federal fraud investigation would move forward with brutal speed. I walked out of the towering glass building and stepped back into the morning sun. I took a deep breath of the city air, feeling entirely reborn. I drove back to my suburban neighborhood, parked the rental car 3 streets over, and slipped silently back through my own back door. I climbed the stairs and returned to my dark master bedroom, sliding back under the heavy duvet. I slowed my breathing and closed my eyes, resuming my role as the dying, ignorant old man. I listened as Valerie finally came upstairs to check on me. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, listening to my slow, rhythmic breathing. I could sense her satisfaction. She truly believed her sinister plan was working flawlessly. She quietly closed the door, leaving me alone in the dark. Let them pick out their expensive flowers and polish their imported shoes. Let them smile and laugh and pretend they had won the ultimate prize. The quiet before the storm had officially arrived. They were happily walking out onto a fragile suspension bridge that I had already rigged to collapse. The foundation was gone, the support cables were cut, and the final structure was completely hollow. And this coming Saturday, I was going to gladly watch them fall into the abyss they created. I woke up the next morning with the sharp focus of a man preparing to detonate a condemned building. The financial trap was already locked in place. My wife and my son were completely severed from my assets. But financial ruin was simply not a sufficient punishment for attempted murder. I needed them to face the absolute crushing weight of the federal justice system. I left the house while Valerie was busy picking out floral arrangements in the living room for her upcoming engagement party. I drove my rental car to a brutalist concrete building in the center of the downtown district. Owen Carter was already waiting for me by the heavy glass security doors. Today, we were not filing lawsuits or hiding assets. Today, we were handing a cartel of domestic assassins over to the federal government. We passed through the metal detectors and took the elevator to the secure floor housing the regional field office of the Drug Enforcement Administration. Owen had used his extensive network of powerful legal contacts to secure an emergency joint meeting. Waiting for us in a sterile, windowless conference room were two senior federal agents and a lead investigator from the state medical board. They looked at me with the polite skepticism reserved for wealthy older men embroiled in bitter marital disputes. They assumed I was just another jealous husband looking to cause professional trouble for his wife's new lover. They had absolutely no idea they were about to review the blueprints of a flawless medical homicide. I took my seat at this long table. I did not waste time with emotional appeals or angry rants about my broken marriage. I opened my leather briefcase and laid out the physical evidence with the exact same methodical precision I used to present structural integrity reports. I placed the amber plastic bottle containing the original lethal pills directly in the center of the table. Next to it, I placed the official prescription pad slip signed by Dr. Gavin Pierce. Then I handed copies of the independent toxicological analysis to the medical board investigator. I watched the atmosphere in the room completely transform. The polite skepticism evaporated the very second the medical investigator read the chemical breakdown of the pills. The investigator pushed her reading glasses up her nose and looked at the federal agents with genuine horror in her eyes. She explained to the room that the medication prescribed was a strictly controlled synthetic stimulant. It was a chemical designed exclusively for emergency resuscitation in intensive care units. She stated clearly that prescribing this specific aggressive compound to a man recovering from a recent cardiac event was not medical malpractice. It was a deliberate, calculated death sentence. Dr. Pierce had bypassed the heavily monitored hospital pharmacy system and used his private clinic credentials to procure a highly restricted substance. He had weaponized his medical license to orchestrate an untraceable murder. The federal agents leaned forward entirely focused on the evidence. But the physical pills were only the murder weapon. I needed to prove intent. I needed to prove the entire conspiracy. I pulled out my digital voice recorder and placed it next to the pill bottle. I pressed the play button. The cold, sterile walls of the federal conference room amplified the voices of my family. The agents listened in absolute silence as Valerie and Cameron casually discussed the exact timeline of my death. They heard my own son calculating the massive life insurance payout. They heard the arrogant laughter of the doctor, assuring my wife that the coroner would never ask questions about an old man with a weak heart. The lead agent reached out and paused the recording. His jaw was clenched tight. The case had instantly escalated from a complex medical malpractice complaint into a massive federal conspiracy involving wire fraud, attempted homicide, and the illegal distribution of severe controlled substances. The medical board investigator immediately reached for her phone. She stated that Dr. Pierce's medical license was suspended effectively immediately pending criminal prosecution. He would never wear a white coat or step foot inside a clinic ever again. His entire professional legacy was completely eradicated in a matter of seconds. Owen Carter took control of the conversation. He pointed out the most critical piece of intelligence we had gathered. He reminded the federal agents that Valerie and Dr. Pierce were actively planning a lavish destination wedding. They had booked expensive luxury villas in the Bahamas for the following week. The Bahamas is a foreign jurisdiction with complex extradition treaties. Owen made it perfectly clear that Dr. Pierce possessed the financial resources and the international connections to vanish the moment he realized his medical license was under investigation. He was an extreme flight risk. If they delayed the arrest, the doctor and my wife would simply board a plane and disappear into the Caribbean, leaving my son to face the legal consequences entirely alone. The federal agents completely agreed. They could not afford to let a doctor who weaponized controlled substances slip through their fingers and cross international borders. They needed to execute the federal arrest warrants immediately to ensure the conspirators were taken into custody simultaneously. They began discussing a coordinated raid on the doctor's private clinic for the following Monday morning. I raised my hand and stopped them. I told them Monday was entirely too late. I told them that if they wanted to catch every single member of the conspiracy in one location, completely off guard, and stripped of all their defenses, they needed to execute the warrants on Saturday. I explained that this coming Saturday afternoon, Valerie and Dr. Pierce were hosting a massive, extravagant engagement party. The celebration was taking place on the grand outdoor terrace of the most exclusive country club in the entire state. Cameron would be there drinking imported champagne. Valerie would be wearing a designer dress paid for with my stolen retirement funds. Dr. Pierce would be surrounded by his wealthy, arrogant colleagues. They would be completely relaxed, surrounded by 100 guests boasting about their bright, beautiful future. It was the absolute perfect environment for a tactical strike. They would be trapped on an elevated terrace with absolutely no warning and nowhere to run. The federal agents looked at each other and nodded. They saw the tactical advantage of cornering all the suspects in a single controlled environment. They agreed to secure the federal warrants for attempted murder, prescription fraud, and conspiracy. They promised to assemble a joint tactical team with the local police department to raid the country club on Saturday afternoon. They thanked me for handing them a perfectly wrapped criminal case and promised that the people who tried to end my life would spend the rest of theirs in federal prison. I walked out of the federal building, with Owen Carter walking quietly beside me. The sky above the city was a brilliant, clear blue. I had spent my entire life designing structures that could withstand the most brutal elements of nature. I built foundations meant to last for centuries. Valerie and Cameron had tried to tear down my life, thinking I was nothing more than fragile glass. They thought I would shatter without making a sound. But they forgot what I am made of. I am made of steel and concrete and ruthless calculation. The financial accounts were frozen. The legal trust was impenetrable. And now the federal arrest warrants were signed and waiting. Everything was perfectly aligned for one single catastrophic impact. All I had to do now was wait for Saturday. I was going to put on my best suit and attend a party. Saturday morning arrived with a bright, blinding sunlight that pierced through the heavy curtains of the master bedroom. I lay perfectly still under the thick duvet, playing my part for the final time. Valerie was moving frantically around the room, packing a luxurious leather overnight bag. She was humming a soft melody, completely intoxicated by her own perceived brilliance. She had spent the last 2 hours preparing for what she told me was a much-needed women's wellness retreat. She claimed the immense stress of caring for a dying husband had taken a severe toll on her physical and mental health. She told me she desperately needed a weekend of spa treatments, deep tissue massages, and silent meditation to recharge her exhausted spirit. She even fabricated a detailed itinerary, mentioning a fictional group of supportive friends who were supposedly joining her for emotional support. She walked over to the edge of the bed, wearing a casual but clearly expensive linen outfit that she had undoubtedly purchased with my stolen retirement funds. She leaned down and pressed her soft lips against my forehead. The kiss felt like the cold touch of a venomous snake against my skin. She whispered in a soothing, maternal voice, telling me to rest and to make absolutely sure I took my new aggressive medication exactly on schedule. She promised me that our son Cameron would drop by later in the afternoon to bring me a hot meal and check on my fluctuating blood pressure. I kept my eyes half closed, letting my breathing remain shallow and ragged. I thanked her for her endless dedication to my health and told her to go enjoy her beautiful restorative weekend. She smiled a smile so full of absolute arrogance and greed that it took every ounce of my disciplined willpower not to reach up and grab her by the throat. She picked up her heavy leather bag, turned her back to me, and walked out of the room without a single backward glance. I listened to the rhythmic clicking of her designer heels descending the wooden staircase. I heard the heavy front door open and close with a solid thud. I waited exactly 3 minutes until I heard the powerful engine of her pristine white sedan roar to life and reverse out of the concrete driveway. The moment the sound of her tires faded down the quiet suburban street, the suffocating atmosphere of the house completely evaporated. The sick, dying old man vanished into the morning air. I threw off the heavy duvet and stood up. I did not shuffle my feet. I did not hunch my shoulders to protect a weak heart. I stood at my full height, feeling the raw strength in my legs and the steady, reliable beating of my pulse. I walked over to the corner of the room where I had kept the thick, ugly wooden walking cane for the past week. I picked it up, feeling the cheap rubber grip under my palm. I carried it down the carpeted hallway and threw it violently into the bottom of the kitchen trash bin. The heavy thud of the wood hitting the plastic was profoundly satisfying. I did not need a prop anymore. I needed my armor. I walked into the master bathroom and turned the shower on, adjusting the temperature dial to the coldest possible setting. I stood under the freezing water, letting the icy stream shock my entire biological system awake. I washed away the sweat, the stagnation, and the pathetic vulnerability I had carefully cultivated over the last several days. I stepped out of the freezing water and stood dripping in front of the large vanity mirror. My silver beard had grown out into a messy, uneven chasado over the past week, making me look defeated and frail. I picked up my razor and a can of shaving cream. I carefully and methodically shaved the rough scruff away until my jawline was sharp and completely clean. I evaluated the man staring back at me in the mirror the same way I would evaluate the structural integrity of a steel beam. He was not a victim. He was a veteran structural engineer preparing to execute a flawless, controlled demolition of his own family. I walked into my expansive walk-in closet and bypassed the loose, comfortable sweatpants and faded cotton shirts I had been wearing to sell my illness. I reached into the very back of the dark wardrobe and pulled out a heavy protective garment bag. Inside was a tailored charcoal gray suit I had purchased years ago in London for a massive corporate engineering gala. I had not worn the garment in over a decade, but it still fit my frame perfectly. I put on a crisp white dress shirt, buttoning it up to my neck. I tied a dark silk tie with absolute precision, ensuring the knot was perfectly symmetrical. I slipped my arms into the charcoal jacket, feeling the heavy, expensive fabric settle perfectly across my broad shoulders. I stepped into a pair of polished black leather Oxford shoes. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror one last time. I did not look like a man on the verge of a massive cardiac arrest. I looked sharp. I looked vibrant. And I looked incredibly dangerous. I walked out of the house, leaving the front door completely unlocked. There was absolutely nothing left inside those walls that I cared to protect. I walked 3 streets over to where I had parked my rented gray sedan in the shadows. I sat in the driver's seat, feeling the cool air conditioning against my clean-shaven face. I put the car in gear and drove toward the most exclusive zip code in the entire city. The drive took 45 minutes, but it felt like the blink of an eye. My mind was completely clear and focused. I was calculating the final variables of my plan, anticipating every possible human reaction, and adjusting my tactical strategy accordingly. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent working to provide a beautiful life for my wife and my son. They had taken that foundation and tried to bury me underneath it. Now I was going to pull the support columns out from under them. I turned onto the long, winding road leading up to the prestigious country club. The private road was lined with ancient oak trees and perfectly manicured hedges paid for by the massive membership fees of the city elite. I had been a premium member of this exact club for over 20 years. I knew the general manager by his first name. I knew the security guards who patrolled the perimeter. I knew exactly the layout of the grand outdoor terrace where Valerie and Dr. Pierce were currently celebrating their stolen future. I pulled the gray sedan through the main iron gates, giving a polite, casual nod to the security guard, who waved me through without a second thought. I navigated the sprawling private parking lot, looking for a very specific vehicle. It did not take me long to find it. Parked directly in the front row, occupying a reserved spot meant for VIP guests, was a sleek, aggressive black Porsche. I knew from my private investigator's detailed report that Dr. Pierce had recently leased the luxury sports car to match his arrogant, inflated ego. I parked my unremarkable rental car directly next to the gleaming black vehicle. I turned off the engine and sat in the silence for a brief moment, gathering my thoughts. I opened my car door and stepped out onto the hot asphalt. The afternoon sun was bright and unforgiving, casting harsh shadows across the pavement. From across the manicured green lawns, I could hear the distinct, lively sounds of a massive, expensive celebration. The smooth, upbeat tempo of a live professional jazz band drifted through the warm summer air, mingling with the high-pitched laughter of wealthy, oblivious socialites. I could hear the sharp, clear clinking of expensive crystal champagne glasses, toasting to a beautiful, fraudulent romance. I began to walk toward the main clubhouse, taking long, confident strides. Every step brought me closer to the grand terrace. I could smell the rich aroma of catered gourmet food and the sweet scent of expensive floral arrangements wafting on the breeze. My wife and the man who actively wanted to kill me were up there, surrounded by 100 guests basking in the glory of their perfectly executed criminal plan. They thought I was lying alone in a dark bedroom, waiting for my failing heart to finally stop beating. They thought they had secured my fortune and erased my existence from the world. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored charcoal suit. I walked up the wide stone steps leading to the heavy glass terrace doors. The quiet before the storm was officially over. I was about to introduce them to the absolute crushing weight of reality. I placed both hands against the polished brass handles of the massive oak doors leading out to the grand terrace. The cool metal felt grounding beneath my palms. I could hear the lively tempo of a live jazz quartet filtering through the thick wood, mingling with the bright, carefree laughter of 100 wealthy guests. I took one final deep breath, filling my healthy lungs with air, and I pushed the heavy doors open, stepping out into the warm afternoon sun. The terrace was a sprawling ocean of pastel silk dresses and tailored summer suits. The sky above was a brilliant cloudless blue, offering a picture-perfect backdrop for a celebration built entirely on a foundation of lies. Waiters in crisp white shirts weaved seamlessly through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with imported caviar, smoked salmon, and towering crystal flutes of expensive champagne. It was a picture of absolute luxury and arrogant celebration. I stood at the edge of the patio, letting my eyes scan the crowd, with the cold, precise focus of a predator surveying a closed trap. I saw Dr. Gavin Pierce standing near the outdoor marble bar, holding court with a group of older men who looked like senior hospital administrators and wealthy investors. He was wearing a light gray designer suit, looking perfectly tanned and ridiculously pleased with himself. He was laughing loudly at some joke, raising his glass in a toast to his own perceived brilliance and undeniable charm. He looked like a man who believed he had outsmarted the entire world. A few yards away, near a towering floral arrangement of imported white orchids, stood my son Cameron and his wife Natalie. They were clinking their glasses together, completely relaxed, bathing in the glow of the stolen money that was currently funding this extravagant afternoon. Natalie was admiring a massive diamond ring on her finger, likely purchased with the funds drained from my retirement accounts. And then I saw her. Valerie was standing in the direct center of the terrace, surrounded by a tight circle of her closest friends. She was wearing a stunning, plunging, brilliant red dress. It was the exact same dress from the photograph I had seen sitting on the doctor's desk. The dress she had worn on that luxury yacht, while laughing behind my back. She looked radiant and youthful, completely unburdened by the fact that she believed I was currently lying in a dark room waiting for my heart to stop beating. I began to walk forward. I did not shuffle my feet. I did not lean forward or clutch my chest in simulated agony. I walked with the heavy, measured, deliberate strides of a man who has spent 40 years walking across high-altitude steel beams and inspecting massive concrete foundations. Every step was planted with absolute, undeniable authority, projecting a physical power that commanded the space around me. I moved directly into the center of the crowded terrace, weaving past oblivious socialites who were too busy gossiping about country club politics to notice the storm gathering right beside them. Cameron was the very first person to see me. He was in the middle of taking a long sip from his champagne flute, throwing his head back in a carefree, arrogant laugh. As his eyes drifted casually across the patio, his gaze locked directly onto my face. The physical transformation was instantaneous, and incredibly beautiful to witness. The healthy color completely drained from his cheeks, turning his skin a sickly pale gray. The smug, arrogant laugh died instantly in his throat, choking him into silence. His brain could simply not process the mathematical impossibility of my presence. His fingers simply stopped working. The expensive crystal flute slipped from his numb hands and fell toward the stone patio. The glass hit the hard ground, shattering into 100 jagged pieces with a sharp, violent crack that echoed across the terrace. The sharp, sudden sound of the breaking glass severed the casual, comfortable atmosphere of the party. Natalie turned to look at her husband with deep annoyance to see what he had dropped, and then she followed his terrified, frozen gaze directly to me. She gasped, taking a clumsy, stumbling step backward and pressing her hand over her mouth in pure shock. The sudden commotion drew the attention of the surrounding guests, who began to part ways, creating a clear, open path between myself and my wife. Valerie was mid-sentence telling an animated story to her circle of friends when she heard the glass shatter. She spun around, a look of mild irritation on her face, ready to scold a clumsy waiter for ruining her perfect afternoon. But the irritation vanished the exact second her eyes met mine. The radiant, triumphant bride-to-be was suddenly staring at a ghost who refused to die. Her mouth opened slightly, but absolutely no sound came out. The champagne glass in her own hand began to tremble so violently that the golden liquid spilled over the rim and stained her perfectly manicured fingers. She looked at my tailored charcoal suit and my clean-shaven face, realizing in one terrifying heartbeat that the sick, fragile old man had been a complete fabrication. Dr. Gavin Pierce heard the silence spreading and turned away from his wealthy medical colleagues. The arrogant, confident smile melted off his face, leaving behind a mask of absolute paralyzing confusion. He looked at Valerie, then looked back at me, trying desperately to understand how the dying old man he had prescribed a lethal dose of medication to was currently standing 50 feet away, looking healthier and more dangerous than ever before. He instinctively took a step back, bumping into the marble bar, as his medical expertise warred with the impossible reality standing in front of him. The ripple effect of my arrival moved through the crowd with breathtaking speed. The guests closest to the shattering glass stopped talking, turning their heads in unison to see what had caused the disruption. Then the next circle of people fell silent, and the next. It was like watching a massive wave of freezing cold water wash over the entire terrace, freezing everyone in place. The professional jazz band playing on the raised wooden stage noticed the sudden heavy tension rolling across their audience. The saxophone player slowly lowered his brass instrument. The pianist stopped, his hands hovering uncertainly over the black and white keys. Finally, the upright bass player plucked one last deep, lingering note before the music died completely. The silence that fell over the grand terrace was absolute and deafening. You could hear the gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the oak trees and nothing else. 100 wealthy elite socialites were now standing perfectly still, staring in dead silence at the uninvited guest. These were people who had undoubtedly been fed a tragic, sympathetic story about my rapidly declining health and my impending demise. They were looking at the man who was supposed to be bedridden and dying, currently standing tall, immaculate, and radiating pure, unadulterated menace in the very center of an engagement party funded entirely by his stolen money. I stood my ground, letting the heavy, suffocating silence wrap around the terrace. I watched the absolute terror settle deep into the eyes of my betrayers, knowing that the trap I had meticulously built for them was now officially sprung, and there was absolutely no escape. I did not break the suffocating silence with a shout or a dramatic outburst. I walked with steady, measured steps directly toward the raised wooden stage where the jazz band stood completely frozen. The musicians parted like water, allowing me to step up onto the low platform. I reached out and took the heavy silver microphone from its metallic stand. The brief, sharp screech of audio feedback echoed across the terrace, making several guests flinch and cover their ears. I wrapped my hand around the microphone, looking out over the sea of pale, terrified faces. I locked my eyes directly onto Dr. Gavin Pierce, who was still pressed defensively against the marble bar. I spoke into the microphone, allowing my voice to project with a smooth, resonant calm that contrasted entirely with the absolute chaos I was about to unleash. I welcomed everyone to the engagement celebration. I told the crowd that I wanted to personally thank Dr. Pierce and my beautiful wife, Valerie, for hosting such an incredibly lavish afternoon. I swept my free hand toward the towering white orchids and the waiters holding trays of expensive caviar. I told the 100 wealthy socialites that it was a truly spectacular event and that I was uniquely qualified to appreciate its grandeur, because my son Cameron and Dr. Pierce had used exactly $450,000 stolen directly from my private retirement fund to pay for every single drop of champagne they were currently drinking. A collective gasp rippled through the affluent crowd. The older hospital administrators and wealthy investors standing near the doctor stepped away from him as if he had suddenly caught a highly contagious disease. Cameron buried his face in his hands near the floral arrangements, physically folding under the weight of the public exposure. Natalie stared at him with a wide, horrific realization that her luxurious lifestyle was a catastrophic fraud. I did not give them a single second to recover. I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored charcoal suit and pulled out the amber plastic prescription bottle. I held it up high in the afternoon sun, making sure the medical professionals in the audience could clearly see the pharmacy label. I addressed the colleagues of the doctor, directly speaking with the clinical precision of a forensic auditor. I explained that 6 months ago I had suffered a mild heart attack. I told them that Dr. Pierce, acting as my primary cardiologist, had aggressively prescribed this specific medication to supposedly manage my blood pressure. I read the chemical name of the extreme-grade stimulant aloud, letting the complex medical terminology echo across the silent terrace. I watched the faces of the senior hospital administrators drain of all color. They recognized the drug instantly. They knew exactly what it was designed to do. I continued speaking into the microphone, my voice echoing like a final judicial sentence. I explained that I had taken the prescription to an independent laboratory for a comprehensive toxicological analysis. I told the crowd of medical experts that the lab results confirmed taking that massive synthetic stimulant with my specific recovering cardiac profile would have violently accelerated my heart rate until my chest literally tore itself apart from the inside. I told them it would have caused a massive fatal myocardial infarction within 48 hours. I lowered the bottle and looked directly into the terrified eyes of the man who had tried to execute me. I stated clearly and loudly that this was not a tragic medical mistake or an accidental pharmaceutical oversight. It was a highly calculated, flawlessly premeditated assassination attempt designed to trigger a massive life insurance payout before the wedding. The terrace erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked murmurs and terrified whispers. Guests began setting their crystal champagne flutes down on the nearest tables, suddenly disgusted by the stolen luxury they were consuming. Valerie finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. The immaculate mask of the blushing bride to be completely disintegrated, leaving behind a desperate, hysterical woman watching her entire fraudulent empire burn to ashes. She lunged forward, her bright red dress flashing in the sunlight, rushing the wooden stage with her hands outstretched. She screamed at the top of her lungs that I was completely insane. She shrieked to her wealthy friends that the heavy heart medication had completely destroyed my mind and that I was suffering from severe paranoid delusions. She reached out desperately, trying to claw the silver microphone away from my hand to silence the broadcast of her crimes. I did not back away. I simply shifted my weight, avoiding her frantic grasp, and looked down at her flushed, panicked face. I lowered the microphone just enough to speak directly to her, but kept my voice projected over the audio system, so every single person on the terrace could hear the final nail being driven into her coffin. I told her she did not need to worry about my mental state anymore. I informed her that she should probably be far more concerned about the federal wire fraud injunction that my ruthless legal team had filed against her fraudulent shell company yesterday morning. I watched her eyes widen in absolute disbelief as I calmly explained that the Central Banking Authority had immediately frozen every single corporate and personal account associated with V&P Holdings. I told her that the stolen $450,000 was locked in a digital federal vault and that she and her lover were currently completely and utterly broke. Standing near the edge of the patio, the general manager of the exclusive country club had been listening intently to every word echoing over the audio system. When I mentioned the frozen federal bank accounts and the total absence of any available funds, his professional hospitality demeanor vanished instantly. He knew the massive upfront deposit for this extravagant party was scheduled to clear through those exact corporate accounts by the end of the business day. He immediately reached for the radio clipped to his belt and signaled his private security team. The response was swift and merciless. Waiters abruptly stopped serving the expensive appetizers, retreating toward the kitchen doors. The bartenders began closing the liquor cabinets and locking the premium alcohol away. The realization hit Valerie like a physical blow to the stomach. She looked around the terrace, watching the stern security guards moving quickly to block the main exit doors, preventing anyone from fleeing without settling the massive pending invoice. She had invited 100 of the most powerful people in the city to witness her absolute social and financial annihilation. Total, suffocating panic finally set in. Her breathing became shallow and erratic as she spun around looking for Dr. Pierce to save her. But the doctor was trapped against the marble bar, surrounded by disgusted colleagues who were already pulling out their cellular phones to distance themselves from his impending medical board scandal. Cameron was sobbing quietly near the orchids, abandoned by his wife, who had already marched toward the exit to save her own reputation. I looked out at the ruins of their social standing. The pristine white table linens and the delicate floral centerpieces now looked like the tragic remnants of a sunken ship. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of their desperation, mingling with the expensive perfume Valerie wore. They had constructed a magnificent palace of deception, and I had just detonated the main pillars, leaving them completely buried under the rubble. The beautiful, flawless engagement celebration had transformed into a glorious, inescapable prison of their own making. I stood on the wooden stage holding the microphone, watching the structural collapse of their lives with absolute, perfect satisfaction. The heavy silence that had fallen over the terrace was suddenly shattered. A low, distant wail pierced the warm afternoon air. The sound grew louder, multiplying into a chorus of high-pitched sirens echoing up the long, winding driveway of the exclusive country club. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows lining the main clubhouse, the wealthy guests could see the reflection of bright flashing lights. Brilliant pulses of red and blue painted the walls violently, interrupting the elegant pastel ambiance of the engagement party. Panic rippled through the crowd of socialites as heavy tactical vehicles skidded to a halt on the pristine gravel path just outside the main doors. The heavy glass doors swung open with aggressive force. A coordinated team of local police officers and federal agents from the Drug Enforcement Administration poured onto the outdoor patio. They wore dark tactical vests and windbreakers with bold yellow lettering that contrasted sharply against the delicate white table linens and the imported floral arrangements. The sheer physical presence of the armed federal agents completely suffocated whatever remaining arrogance the crowd possessed. Wealth and social standing offered absolutely no protection against the federal warrants coming through those doors. I stood quietly on the wooden stage, placing the silver microphone back onto its stand, watching the glorious mechanical precision of the raid I had orchestrated unfold right in front of me. The lead federal agent walked with absolute authority straight toward the outdoor marble bar. The wealthy hospital administrators and investors who had been drinking with Dr. Gavin Pierce scattered, instantly treating the cardiologist like a radioactive hazard. Pierce was left standing completely alone, trembling uncontrollably against the polished stone counter. The arrogant, confident medical professional had completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, pathetic criminal. The lead agent did not lower his voice. He spoke with a booming, authoritative tone that carried across the terrified crowd. He addressed Pierce by his full name, stating that he was under federal arrest. The agent firmly grabbed the wrists of the doctor, pulling his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic clicking of heavy steel handcuffs locking into place echoed across the patio. It was a beautiful, mechanical sound. The agent loudly read the list of charges: attempted homicide, federal prescription fraud, the illegal procurement and distribution of severe controlled substances. Pierce opened his mouth to defend himself, to claim it was a massive misunderstanding, but his voice completely failed him. His knees buckled under the crushing weight of reality, and two younger agents had to physically support him by his arms to keep him from collapsing onto the stone tiles. The brilliant medical pioneer was violently dragged away from his own lavish engagement celebration, stripped of his freedom and his dignity in front of every single one of his professional peers. While Pierce was being hauled away toward the flashing lights, a second team of local police officers marched directly toward the towering white orchids. Cameron was still cowering near the floral display, sobbing quietly into his hands. His wife had completely vanished, leaving him to face the consequences of his extreme greed entirely alone. The officers flanked my son, grabbing him by the shoulders and pulling him to his feet. They did not show any mercy for his tears. The arresting officer informed Cameron that he was being taken into federal custody. The charges were listed with brutal clarity: federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, conspiracy to commit murder. I watched the officers lock the steel cuffs around the wrists of my own son. A small, dark part of my paternal soul felt a brief, sharp ache. This was the boy I had raised, the child I had protected and provided for. But the cold, rational engineer inside me quickly reinforced the emotional barrier. This was not my child. This was a ruthless parasite who had calculated the timeline of my failing heart to secure a business bailout. Cameron looked up through his tears, searching the crowd until his eyes locked onto mine. He silently begged me to intervene, to use my authority to stop the police. I did not blink. I did not look away. I simply stared back at him with the cold, dead eyes of a man who had already attended his own funeral. The officers marched him across the patio, leading him out through the heavy glass doors to join the lover of his mother in the back of the waiting police cruisers. The terrace was rapidly emptying as the wealthy guests frantically rushed toward the side exits, desperate to avoid being associated with a massive federal crime scene. In the very center of the ruined celebration stood Valerie. The vibrant red dress she wore, the exact same dress from the photograph on the desk of the doctor, now looked like a glaring beacon of failure. She was completely isolated, surrounded by shattered glass and abandoned crystal champagne flutes. The powerful, affluent woman who had spent months plotting my demise was completely broken. She slowly walked toward the wooden stage, her designer heels dragging across the stone tiles. She looked up at me, her makeup running down her face in dark, messy streaks. Her eyes were wide and frantic, filled with a desperate, manipulative panic. She reached her trembling hands toward me, weeping loudly. She begged me to listen to her. She pleaded that the entire situation was a massive, terrible mistake. She swore she never truly wanted to hurt me, claiming she had just been terribly confused and manipulated by the doctor. She tried to invoke the 35 years of our marriage, desperately attempting to pull at the heartstrings of a man she believed was still weak and deeply in love with her. She cried that we could forgive each other, that we could go back to our quiet suburban home and rebuild our beautiful life together. I stepped down from the wooden stage and walked slowly until I was standing just a few inches away from her. I looked down at the woman who had poured a glass of ice water and patiently waited for my heart to tear itself apart over a steak dinner. I did not feel anger. I did not feel sorrow. I felt absolutely nothing but the cool, calm satisfaction of a perfectly executed structural demolition. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored charcoal suit. I did not pull out a handkerchief to dry her fake tears. I pulled out a thick, folded legal document printed on heavy certified parchment. I held the document out toward her. Her trembling fingers took the paper instinctively. I spoke in a low, steady voice, ensuring she heard every single syllable clearly over the distant wailing of the police sirens. I told her that she could never go back to our quiet suburban home. I explained that the document she was holding was an official 30-day eviction notice issued directly by the legal trustee of my irrevocable blind trust. I told her that the house, the cars, and every single liquid asset I possessed were legally locked inside an impenetrable vault that she would never be able to access. I watched her eyes scan the harsh legal text, reading the absolute, undeniable proof of her total financial ruin. I leaned in closer, ensuring my final words to her would echo in her mind for the rest of her miserable life. I told her that her corporate bank accounts were frozen by the federal government. I told her she had absolutely no money to her name. I told her she had no home to return to tonight. I told her the arrogant younger man she was supposed to marry was currently sitting in the back of a police cruiser facing decades in a federal penitentiary. I told her that her only son was in handcuffs, heading to a concrete cell for wire fraud. I told her that her grand, beautiful life was completely over, and she had absolutely no one to blame but herself. Valerie stood frozen, clutching the eviction notice against her chest. The reality of her absolute destitution crashed down on her, extinguishing the final spark of her manipulative hope. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg for a fraction of mercy, but she was entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her defeat. I did not wait for her to find her voice. I turned my back on the woman in the red dress. I walked smoothly across the stone patio, passing the abandoned tables and the fading, flashing lights of the police cruisers. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and walked out into the warm summer afternoon, leaving the ruins of my old life completely behind me. 6 months have passed since the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the pristine grounds of the country club. The dust from the catastrophic collapse of my family has finally settled. The legal and financial demolition I engineered was absolute, leaving no stone standing. In the quiet aftermath, I watched the justice system meticulously sweep away the debris of their arrogant conspiracy. Dr. Gavin Pierce was the very first to break. The brilliant, arrogant cardiologist who believed he could weaponize his prescription pad to commit the perfect murder completely crumbled under the crushing weight of federal prosecution. When the investigators presented him with the undeniable audio recordings and the independent toxicological reports, his expensive defense attorneys advised him to surrender. He was terrified of facing a full jury trial for premeditated attempted murder, which would have resulted in a life sentence. Instead, he took a federal plea deal. He surrendered his medical license permanently and accepted a sentence of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The man who wore tailored suits and leased luxury sports cars now wears a standard-issue jumpsuit, navigating the brutal reality of a concrete cell block. His career, his wealth, and his freedom were entirely erased. The fate of my son Cameron offered a different kind of closure. The federal prosecutors did not show him an ounce of mercy for his role in the corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. He was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. When the judge handed down the sentence, I sat in the back of the courtroom and felt absolutely nothing. The paternal bond had been permanently severed the morning I stood in his hallway and listened to him calculate the profit margin on my death. His wife Natalie reacted exactly as my forensic attorney had predicted. The moment the steel handcuffs clicked around Cameron's wrists, her loyalty completely vanished. She filed for divorce before he even survived his first week behind bars. She severed all ties, distancing herself from the scandal and leaving him to face his financial ruin and his incarceration entirely alone. He traded his father for a business bailout and ended up losing his company, his wife, and his freedom. But the steepest and most poetic descent belonged to Valerie. The woman who had worn a brilliant red dress and laughed on a luxury yacht was completely stripped of her magnificent illusions. The irrevocable blind trust functioned exactly as designed. The 30-day eviction notice was enforced by local authorities, forcefully removing her from the sprawling suburban home she believed she was going to inherit. With her fraudulent shell company frozen and her younger lover locked away in a federal prison, Valerie was left with absolutely nothing. Today, she is living in a cramped, humid studio apartment on the industrial side of the city. To pay her meager rent and survive, she was forced to take a minimum-wage retail job. The soft, perfectly manicured hands that had tried to feed me poison now spend 8 hours a day folding clothes and scanning barcodes under harsh fluorescent lights. She stands on her feet all day, catering to rude customers trapped in a miserable life of her own making. Every single morning, she wakes up in a tiny room and remembers the fortune she threw away simply because she could not wait for a natural end. I am far away from the wreckage of their lives. I am currently sitting at a small wrought iron table on an outdoor patio in Florence, Italy. The afternoon sun washes over the ancient cobblestone streets, warming the cool autumn air. The rich, dark aroma of freshly brewed espresso mingles with the scent of baked bread from the cafe next door. The oppressive, suffocating atmosphere of my old suburban house feels like a distant, faded nightmare. I take a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs completely. My chest does not ache. My heart does not flutter or skip a beat. In fact, my most recent medical evaluation by an honest, highly recommended specialist confirmed that my cardiovascular system is perfectly healthy. My recovery from the mild heart attack is complete. It turns out that the greatest strain on my heart was not blocked arteries or advanced age. The true deadly stress was living in a house saturated with deceit, sharing a bed with a predator, and carrying the toxic weight of a fundamentally broken family. Once those poisonous elements were completely surgically removed from my life, my body naturally began to heal. I feel vibrant. I feel sharp. I am 62 years old, but the energy coursing through my veins makes me feel decades younger. I reach across the small table and open my secure laptop. I am currently reviewing a set of complex architectural blueprints for a highly lucrative private consulting project. An international development firm hired me to oversee the structural reinforcement of a historic European villa. I trace the load-bearing walls and the support beams on the digital screen, feeling the familiar, comforting rhythm of my profession. Building something strong and enduring is a beautiful process, especially after spending the last 6 months orchestrating a demolition. I switch browser tabs and log into my private banking portal. The screen loads instantly. I look at the numbers reflecting across the dashboard, and a profound, peaceful satisfaction settles deep into my bones. The Central Banking Authority concluded their federal fraud investigation exactly 2 months ago. The $450,000 that Valerie and Cameron had systematically stolen was fully recovered from the frozen accounts and returned entirely to my portfolio. My wealth is completely secure, locked safely inside the blind trust managed by Owen Carter. My legacy is protected, and my future is funded entirely by the fruits of my own labor. I close the laptop and lean back in my chair, listening to the distant chiming of a church bell echoing across the Italian city. I watch the people walking through the vibrant plaza, tourists and locals sharing laughter and conversation. I think about the terrifying journey of the last 6 months. Society conditions us to believe that as we grow older, our greatest vulnerabilities are biological. We are taught to fear high cholesterol, failing joints, and the inevitable physical decline of aging. We spend thousands of dollars on vitamins, gym memberships, and medical consultations, trying to protect ourselves from the invisible enemies inside our own bodies. But the absolute chilling truth that I discovered in a sterile cardiology clinic is completely different. The greatest and most lethal threat to a man's life is not always an abnormal heart rate or a sudden spike in blood pressure. Sometimes the most dangerous element in your universe is the person pouring your water, smiling warmly at you across the dining room table and asking how your day went. Betrayal is a silent cancer that hides behind domestic routines and familiar faces. It is an insidious disease that preys on unconditional trust and blind loyalty. I pick up my porcelain cup and take a slow sip of the rich, dark espresso, tasting the bitter and sweet notes perfectly balanced. I survived the ultimate structural failure because I refused to ignore the tiny microscopic cracks in the foundation. I survived because I chose to look the horrifying truth directly in the eye without blinking. I realized that the best medicine in the world is not a chalky white pill handed to you by an arrogant doctor. It is not an herbal supplement or an expensive pharmaceutical compound. The ultimate cure, the only thing that can truly save your life when you are surrounded by monsters, is the absolute ruthless and unapologetic application of the truth. I set my cup down on the table, enjoying the perfect, beautiful silence of my brand new life. The ultimate lesson drawn from this harrowing experience is that blind trust, even when given to our closest family members, can be our most fatal vulnerability. We are conditioned to believe that blood ties inherently guarantee loyalty and protection, but true family is defined by mutual respect and honest actions, not merely by a shared last name. When we ignore the subtle red flags of greed and manipulation, for the sake of domestic peace, we inadvertently arm our own executioners. Survival requires the courage to view our loved ones through a lens of objective truth, recognizing that establishing ruthless boundaries is a necessary act of self-preservation. If you found strength in this story of survival and justice, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments how you have established healthy boundaries in your own life.